So I want to start by talking about the recent Munich Security Conference. I would like to know your main takeaways from the conference regarding the Russia-Ukraine war.
Well, I guess the main theme, which is causing all the headlines, is about the United States shifting its position in the international system. So, I guess in very broad terms, the United States has recognized that the unipolar order has more or less come to an end. They want to pivot more to Asia, which is why they want to get out of the Ukraine war. And by getting out of Ukraine, it enables America to start getting out of Europe.
The US doesn't want to commit to Ukraine security once they form a deal with Russia. So do you think the NATO countries minus the US can shoulder the burden of Ukraine security?
No.
Hello everyone. Today I'm honored to have Professor Glenn Diesen. He is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and the author of many books, the latest one being The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Professor Diesen, it's an honor to have you. Thank you for your time and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
So I want to start by talking about the recent Munich Security Conference. I would like to know your main takeaways from the conference regarding the Russia-Ukraine war.
Well, I guess the main theme, which is causing all the headlines, is about the United States shifting its position in the international system. So, I guess in very broad terms, the United States has recognized that the unipolar order has more or less come to an end. They want to pivot more to Asia, and they can't be everywhere anymore simply because they are in a relative decline. They don't have the same power, obviously, than they did in the 90s. So if you're going to pivot to Asia, you have to pivot away from somewhere, and that somewhere is Europe. So the Americans want to reduce their presence there, which is why they want to get out of the Ukraine war. And by getting out of Ukraine, it enables America to start getting out of Europe. So this is why the Americans made it very clear at this Munich Security Summit that in terms of resolving the war in Ukraine, there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine, which was the main source of the war. They will have to make territorial concessions as they can't get this back, that is the Ukrainians. And also in a settlement, the Ukrainians will not get any American security guarantees, because this could pull America not just into the war, but keep them in Europe as well. And they want to leave. And they made this very clear. They also said that Europe is no longer a strategic focus of the United States. So the Americans are, they're preparing to go. This is causing panic in Europe for many reasons. One, of course, the fear that peace might break out and the war in Ukraine has been lost for NATO. And the second, obviously, is that America's leaving Europe, which would be diminish the geopolitical relevance of Europe. Again, the European leaders have bet everything there was on being the junior partner of the United States. And so we see not just the post-Cold War order coming to an end, but indeed the entire post-Second World War II order coming very quickly to an end. And just to mark the final almost insults to the Europeans is the speech by Vice President JD Vance, in which he pointed out that the Europeans, their main concern shouldn't be China or Russia. It's the descent into authoritarianism we see in Europe. And he made some examples because over the past few years, past few months, there's been a tendency to engage in more and more censorship. We're talking about banning political opposition parties. In Romania, as Vance pointed out, they simply annulled the election results because they didn't like the guy who won the presidential elections. So they made up some silly excuses, which proved to be false. But the elections results are annulled nonetheless. So he was very worried about the democratic decline in Europe as well. So it's this was probably the most, at least in my time, it's been the most significant meeting there was in Munich.
So since you mentioned JD Vance's speech, I would like to ask you, how does Europe kind of retreat from this descent into authoritarianism? Because like you mentioned, the Romanian election was cancelled. In Germany, they've toyed with the idea of banning the AfD. And the EU in general has been criticized for having a very top-down approach and over-regulation in terms of the economy. So how does Europe recover from this? Because Trump will also have the tendency to make deals with individual countries.
Yeah, well, this has been always a problem with the European Union, which is how do you get all of these countries to cooperate, to align all their policies? Again, this many countries integrating. What is 27 or 28 countries now? I lose count because there's a lot of countries. It doesn't really make it's a huge challenge to get everyone these to align because everyone has different national interests. So instead of focusing on national interests, they say, well, we have to focus on values, our common values. But this is becoming very artificial because in reality, countries do have interests, but all they do now is they frame every issue as good versus evil. So everything is, let's say you want to look at whether or not you should expand the European Union, taking more members. Then they say, well, if you expand, it means more Europe, more democracy, more freedom. If you oppose it, it means you're threatening stability and peace and you hate democracy. So everything is framed in binary good versus evil. And this is why every country can be shamed effectively into adjusting to or adopting the desired policies. So it's become a very unattractive way of doing politics because now what happens in such a system is when countries no longer sufficiently accommodate their national interest is you're going to see political oppositions beginning to emerge at the periphery because of all the vacuum left behind. So you mentioned Germany. In Germany now they are buying Russian gas from India at a high increased price because they don't want to buy from Russia because that's somehow immoral. But if you buy it more expensively from India and then begin to deindustrialize because it's more expensive, then it's okay. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, of course. So in such a climate, you're going to have political opposition coming along saying, well, this is nonsense. What's the difference? The Russians getting paid, we're deindustrializing. What's the point of this? And this is where we are. And in such a climate, how do you maintain the unity in the EU and also maintain the managed opposition? Well, you're going to have to limit what is acceptable opposition. So they begin to then label anyone who disagree with them as being far right, and then the assumption being that they don't have a position in polite society and they have to be squeezed out. And this is, by the way, what they also did in Romania. They, after annulling the election, even in other media around the EU, they're suggesting, oh, they're far right, they're radicals. If you complain about this, you don't take Russian interference seriously, so you might be a puppet of the Kremlin. So this is what you do: you shame all opposition, and if that's not sufficient, then you can do some censorship. And in the case of maybe AfD from in Germany or to Romania, you can just cancel your opposition as well if they don't fall in line. So it's a very dangerous path they're on. So I think the hysteria against Vance's comments, I think they're a bit unfounded. I would like to know what the counter argument is. Instead, I hear a lot of speeches that he's MAGA, he's populist, he's a Christian fundamentalist, and you can't criticize us. We're Europe, we are a democracy. If you criticize us, then you're anti-democracy. It's just it's a lot of words without any content. So I would like to know what the counter argument is, because I thought he brought up some very valid points, but it has to be accepted that this is a shock to the Europeans, because whenever we meet in Munich every year, it's just a hate fest of how wonderful we are and how awful the Chinese and Russians and the Iranians and everyone else is. So, and suddenly the Americans come along and they start to shine a light at the democratic decline in Europe and suggesting, the war is lost, perhaps we should get along with the Russians. I mean, this is not what we're used to. So it's people are up in arms here, and so far they're just venting a bit. So we'll see if they actually will do something to counter the Americans, or if they just will have a few weeks of hysteria before settling down.
Like you said, there's been no counter argument to any of the points put forth by Vice President JD Vance, and one of his main points was also stemming the tide of illegal immigration. So this has led to the rise of many nationalist parties in Europe. So, how will the EU deal with this rising tide of nationalism?
Well, that's the thing. I think you have to differentiate between the disease and the symptom. I mean, when you and among the political right, there's a lot rising on the political right. A lot of them are just favorable of having greater national sovereignty. They're controlling borders. They want more restoring democracy. More more sensible economic interests, preventing deindustrialization. But of course, there's also some uglier elements. You have some, whenever you have a lot of immigration, especially legal immigration, you're going to have some xenophobic, very ugly voices coming along as well. So they're obviously there. But it's also important to recognize what gave all of them oxygen, what has fueled them, is because there's been a lot of illegal migration, and we didn't create any any legitimate space to argue against it, because anyone who criticizes it, well, they can be called a racist or a xenophobe. So, having a lot of immigration, it is a challenge. You do have to address it. If you don't address it, then the more ugly voices, the actual racist and extremists, they will begin to monopolize on the critique. So I think it's very unfortunate, but this is also a consequence when you don't deal with the world as it is. You don't create any legitimate space for criticizing a policy, because when you have millions of people coming into the continent from different background, which is a cultural. It's nothing. Doesn't have to be anything wrong with them. Again, this is not not me venting against immigrants. I think it's not being for or against immigrants. It's just when you have a lot of immigration, it should be addressed. It has a lot of positive aspects. It can have a lot of challenges, but as long as you don't address it at all, then you hand over the whole debate to some very ugly people, and now you see some. Among the ranks of the right, you see some ugly figures popping up as well. I'm just saying we shouldn't celebrate these ugly people. I'm just saying we should realize where they're coming from. So we have to address, again, the world as it is.
I think I broadly agree with your point that not addressing illegal immigration by the establishment parties will lead to the rise in a lot of these far right, as they are labeled, parties which are really spew venom against the migrants, even the legal ones as well. So now I want. Yeah,
Sorry,
please.
and that's the dangerous part, because you had a lot of migrants coming in. They've been welcomed, they feel welcome, but now you end up in a worse situation where you have all these people who have come, and now there's a backlash because it hasn't been managed, and now there's as you said, a venom against all of them. So this is the worst situation you want. You take in a lot of migrants, and then these migrants all feel unwelcomed, and they feel that the overall society is turning on them. Now this is a huge problem. A lot of migrants who are not feeling even welcomed, and this was the problem all along. If you the people who have come there, you have to make sure that they're welcome, that they're also part of society, and they're not second-rate citizens. But we risk spoiling the whole initiative of all the migrants coming, which might be alienated if we don't address with the wider issue. So a lot of this is done under virtuous politics. It's all comfort, like we all have. It's about being kind, being accepting, taking in migrants with open arms. Yeah, this is all good and well, but you will achieve the opposite if you don't deal with the key issues. If you just leave the borders open, and then you essentially criminalize all critical debate. So nobody wins at the end of the day. This is especially the migrants. This is the silly part. So
it remains to be seen how the EU will deal with this migration. So now I want to come to the security aspects of NATO. How will the NATO countries deal with the security situation of Ukraine? Because the US doesn't want to commit to Ukraine security once they form a deal with Russia. So do you think the NATO countries minus the US can shoulder the burden of Ukraine security?
no, it's there's nothing. There's not that much in Europe. They can't really. The capabilities aren't there. It's NATO is America, plus it's friends and allies. But there's no way America can be replaced. Again, people are a bit in shock. They want to talk a big game at the moment. So you have people like Starmer. The British Prime Minister is suggesting we'll carry the burden if the Americans leave. But their military is well, a joke is rude, but it's nothing. They can't really, even if they send their entire army into Ukraine, they will probably be wiped out. There's not that many soldiers, and Yeah, this is not the British Army of the 19th century. It's very different. So it's just, again, it's decoupled from reality, and I think at some point reality will catch up, and they will have to accept, yeah, what is reality, which is that they won't even have that much of a role. And that's another thing, by the way, in the negotiations. People like General Kellogg, who was sent by Trump to assist in negotiating the peace, he was asked at Munich by reporters, can you promise us that Europe will have a role in negotiations? And he said, no, probably you won't. And even now, the Russians and Americans are meeting in Saudi Arabia. They didn't even invite the Ukrainians. But this is reality. They don't ask why. They just say it's unfair. We're Europe. You can't ignore us. But yes, you can ignore them, because the Europeans, for the past 3 years, they didn't even do diplomacy. No European leaders wanted to even sit down with the Russians. They boycotted all diplomacy. They opposed all negotiations. They've set these huge, crazy demands. Pretty much Russia has to capitulate. That's the only thing we accept. And they speak openly about not wanting these negotiations at all. They want to send more weapons. This is the only plan. There's no other plan. They want to send weapons we have, so Ukrainian soldiers, which doesn't exist anymore, can continue to fight. So nothing is real. So the Europeans have set very unrealistic goals and demands. And meanwhile, why would Americans accommodate it? They're not that relevant anymore. Europe has made itself too dependent on the US, and it's become too weak. And if the Europeans complain too much, I think the Americans can just put the Europeans against each other. So this, again, for me, this is very frustrating, because I've been warning about this for many years. I've written books about how this will come and bite us in the behind if you make yourself this dependent on the United States, which is unavoidable if you're going to redivide the continent and remilitarize it. But we're told that, this is an anti-American statement. But here we are, and Europe is irrelevant. So we won't even be invited to the negotiations, and our interest will not be accommodated. And this is the new world, which we haven't found our own position in yet.
I'll come to the negotiations in a few minutes. But my last question about Europe in general was, will Europe be able to deliver the 5% defense spending that Trump has demanded, or at least 3%, which is the minimum that Trump expects?
Well, it's a lot of problems there, which Trump expects. I think the first instinct in Europe is they all want to deliver this to show that they do as they're told, and they show their value to America, so America won't forget Europe. But America has linked this to leaving. That is, you should look after your own security, and we're leaving. So I think that it will start to dawn on the Europeans that it doesn't matter if they do 3%, 5%, that the Americans will still leave. So this is a problem. At the moment, of course, everyone is up in arms, angry about the Russians. Read some newspapers here. It's real crazy talk. This is they created a different social reality. It's kind of frightening to see the headlines here. But so I can imagine the political will being there for 3 to 5%. But also, where's the money going to come from? Germany is the economic powerhouse, effectively driving the EU forward. And the Americans, they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and now there's no more cheap energy. And then, of course, they could import some cheaper gas from Russia, but as I mentioned with the Germans, they think this is moral, so they rather buy the Russian gas from India. So the industries, in the industry, cheap energy is the lifeblood of competitive industry, and they don't have it anymore. So what's happening in Germany? Well, their industries are falling apart. They're deindustrializing, and then the Americans are coming across from the other side of the Atlantic and pushing the Inflation Reduction Act, in which they're giving subsidies to German companies if they move across to America instead. So they're just cannibalizing the industries here, and this is the main problem of Europe now. For centuries, they were the subject of international security. They were the ones sitting at the table, moving the pieces around. We'll do this in Middle East, this to India, this to Latin America. But now the world is very different. They don't realize yet that they are no longer the objects. They're no longer the subjects. They become the objects. They're the pieces being moved around. And so my point is, they don't have the money. They're deindustrializing. The economy is struggling, and now at this point, when the economy is when they're deindustrializing, suddenly they're going to start to remilitarize. It would be an economic suicide. So I don't think it's possible, even though the political willingness or the war enthusiasm is sky high. But we'll see. It's very strange times here in Europe. So.
But the EU has proposed some solutions, right? Like offering bonds or something, which I'm not very familiar with, to raise money.
Yes, but this also is a lot of this is based on credibility and trust as well. So if no one's buying the bonds, then you might have a problem. Also, they have other ways of getting money, which is they stole the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank, and they're taking that money. They're sending some to Ukraine. But this is a very temporary solution, because now the rest of the world is kind of appalled. If you want to look at gold prices increasing, irrespective of what they do to interest rates, it's a very good indication that the trust in not just the European, but the Western financial system is falling apart very quickly. Because if they can do it to the Russians, they can do it to anyone. They can steal the reserves of anyone. So you don't want to keep too much money into the Western financial system, especially if you're China and you know that you're probably next on the chopping block. I mean, if the Americans tell the Europeans to freeze Chinese funds, why wouldn't they? They do everything else. So the trust is gone, and if there's no trust, then the system that starts to break down, and alternatives will emerge. And I think this is where we are. So I doubt that they can raise enough money. I hear the same speeches every few months of how they're gonna digitalize the European economy. They're gonna bring up new industries. They're gonna do this and that, but it's usually just talk. And the same applies to this, as you mentioned before, the 3 to 5% in defense spending. It's like one country can make this decision, but with all of these member states, if they're starting to do something which is, it will be very difficult to harmonize it. One side will always do less than the others, and especially if the Europeans do something that Americans won't like, then Trump can very easily put the Europeans against each other to get what he wants. So it's the Europeans have put themselves in a very vulnerable position. So this is consequence of living in ideological bubble for decades now.
We'll see what happens. Like you said, the future is definitely very going to be tough for Europe.